Russian forces have completely evacuated an important base in the north of Crimea for fear of being attacked by Ukrainian troops. Russian forces have evacuated an entire key base north of Crimea, satellite images recently reviewed by CNN show. This base, near the village of Medvedivka and near the Kherson border, houses a significant amount of Russian ammunition. Images from the European Union's Sentinel-2 satellite from January 21 show a large amount of Russian equipment. Higher-resolution Maxar images from February 11 show dozens of armored vehicles, including tanks and artillery. Newer images taken by the European Union's Sentinel-2 satellite show that most of those vehicles are no longer present at the base. It is not clear why Moscow has moved the equipment or where it has been moved, but earlier this month Russian-installed officials in Crimea signaled that they were concerned about a Ukrainian counterattack on sales. This island. I think the decision to build defensive structures in Crimea and on the approaches to the peninsula is right and reasonable, Crimea's governor, appointed by Russia, Sergei Aksionov, said on April 11. Maxar images from February 11 to February 16 show Russia's massive concentration of defensive structures near Medvedivka, including a network of trenches and wedge-shaped anti-tank concrete barriers known as dragon teeth. A Maxar image from January 3 shows much smaller fortifications earlier in the year. In general, I can say that our armed forces have built a modern, layered defense system that is far-reaching, Aksionov said. This does not mean that they will necessarily be used for the intended purpose. We had to be prepared for any scenario, and we did, he added. Before Aksionov's comments, experts suggested that the withdrawal of Russian military equipment from the base in Medvedivka could be related to defensive operations against a Ukrainian counterattack. 2 senior U.S. military officials said Ukraine is in a favorable position to counterattack. The senior U.S. military commander in Europe told a congressional committee on Wednesday that Ukraine was in a favorable position to counterattack the Russian military. According to the pattern that we have worked very carefully with them, the Ukrainians are in a good position, said the head of U.S. European Command, General Christopher Cavali, adding that the U.S. was working with the Ukrainian military about a possible surprise counterattack. Cavali also said Russia's ground forces are larger today than at the beginning of the conflict, despite suffering many losses in the war against Ukraine. General Cavali told the House Armed Services Committee, Russia's ground forces have been somewhat degraded by this conflict, although today it is larger than it was at the beginning of the conflict. In addition to the army, Russia has several other options, he said. General Cavali said, the Air Force still has thousands of fighters and bombers. So they still take all that conventional energy and mix it up. Slovakia has given Ukraine 13 MiG-29s. Poland has delivered 4 MiG-29s to Ukraine, and Germany has agreed to give 5 more. 3. Putin's true motive for invasion of Ukraine revealed in report. A Russian media outlet claims that Putin regrets having caused the war in Ukraine, which resulted in an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, or ICC, that will follow him for the rest of his life. In that context, the Kremlin has begun to leak out the real cause of Putin's current catastrophic war. Newsweek had a report titled Putin's True Motive for Ukraine Invasion Revealed in Report, which means Putin's real motives for the invasion of Ukraine revealed in the report. An investigation has claimed personal resentment and a desire for revenge were the driving factors behind Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to launch an all-out invasion of Ukraine last February. Verska, an independent Russian news agency founded shortly after the conflict began, published an in-depth report this week titled, How Putin Came to Hate Ukraine, which quotes leads former and current officials in the Russian and Ukrainian governments. Kremlin reporter Ilya Zegulev wrote that Putin's staunch ally, Viktor Medvedchuk, was at the center of the Russian leader's so-called special military operation in the neighboring country, and he was decided to attack Kiev between February and March 2021. Medvedchuk is a pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarch who was freed by Kiev in a prisoner exchange with Russia in September 2022. The 68-year-old has close ties to Putin, who is said to be the godfather. The head of his youngest daughter. Medvedchuk is a former leader of a pro-Russian opposition party in Ukraine, and was arrested by Ukraine's State Security Service, SBU for short, in April 2022, after he escaped from house arrest while awaiting trial for treason. Kiev stripped him of his Ukrainian citizenship. In 2021, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree sanctioning 3 TV stations affiliated with Medvedchuk, forcing them to stop broadcasting. For Putin, this is the last drop of water, Verska writes. In February 2021, a special operation was carried out with the aim of neutralizing Medvedchuk, the news agency said, noting that sanctions were imposed on 112 broadcasters. Ukraine, News One, ZIK, and their owner is Taras Kozak, associate of Medvedchuk. According to Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Action Center, although Kozak is the official owner of the TV channels, the real beneficiary of these stations is Medvedchuk. Zelensky said at the time that the broadcasters were conducting anti-Ukrainian propaganda and interfering in the country's integration into the European Union. Verska writes that these sanctions affected Medvedchuk personally, together with his wife, was placed on the list of investigations by the Security Service of Ukraine in March 2021 for the financing of terrorism. 3 sources close to Putin confirmed that these developments were the last drop in Putin's decision to prepare to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin has decided not to use the tools of soft power anymore. A longtime acquaintance of Putin told the independent media outlet that Putin was angered by the personal attack on Medvedchuk. It was Medvedchuk who influenced the Russian president to invade Ukraine by regularly telling him about pro-Russian sentiments in Ukraine. He talks about territorial loyalty, fooling Putin to trust him, said a source close to Putin's administration. A source said that the Kremlin did not question Medvedchuk's words. Instead of drawing conclusions about the completeness of the information received, analyzing and seeing the obvious picture that they were not expected here, resentment and anger clouded their eyes. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Foreign Ministry for comment via email. 4. U.S. general says Russian submarines are more active in the Atlantic despite the ongoing Ukraine conflict. While Russia continued the war in Ukraine, the U.S. military found that Russian forces elsewhere were not negatively affected by the war in Ukraine. The top U.S. general in Europe said on Wednesday that Russian submarine patrols had been stepped up across the Atlantic. One of those forces is their submarine force. As you well know, it's difficult to speak publicly about undersea warfare and our efforts in that regard. But I can say that the Russians are more active than we've seen in years, and their patrols in the Atlantic and across the Atlantic are at a high level, most of the time. At a higher level than we've ever seen. Years ago, General Christopher Cavally, commander of U.S. European Command, told the House Armed Services Committee on Wednesday. And this happened despite all the efforts they were making inside Ukraine, he said. 5. Russian military plane explodes mid-flight, plunges into lake. Newsweek had an article titled Russian military jet blows up mid-flight, crashes into lake, which means Russian military plane explodes mid-flight, crashes into lake. A Russian MiG-31 fighter jet exploded on Wednesday and crashed into a lake, seriously injuring both pilots, who parachuted from the plane, according to multiple reports and confirmations by the Air Force. Russian officials. As reported by Air Force Technology, the MiG-31 Foxhound is a 2-seat, long-range supersonic interceptor manufactured by the Russian Aircraft Corporation, formerly Mikoyan and MiG, and is mainly used by the Russian and Kazakh Air Forces. Created in 1975 during the Cold War, it was the first Soviet fighter to have the ability to look down and shoot straight down. More than 500 MiG-31 aircraft were produced, of which about 370 were delivered to the Russian Air Force and 30 to the Kazakhstan Air Force. In July 2020, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that investments in the construction of the aircraft will include modernization. Russian state media agency TASS, citing a comment from the Russian Defense Ministry, reported via Telegram that the plane that crashed was a MiG-31 fighter jet conducting a training flight in the Murmansk region. Baza, an independent online news agency, reported via Telegram that the plane crashed into a lake in the village of Rizguba. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov said initially, both pilots ejected. The pilots were promptly evacuated by helicopters of the Search and Rescue Force, and their lives and health were not in danger. An update provided by TASS shortly thereafter clarified that the pilots were indeed hospitalized and in serious condition, according to health services. The update contradicts a report by RIA Novosti, another Russian state media outlet, which stated on Telegram that the plane crashed in a deserted place and that both pilots were successfully pushed out. Nothing threatened their life or health. Baza published a video clip on Telegram showing bystanders from afar watching the explosion unfold before their eyes, with the plane plummeting into the lake. Residents reported seeing a pair of parachutes leaving the ship. Online news outlet Siren posted a video clip from another angle of the explosion on Telegram. Retired Air Force pilot Colonel Lee Ellis told Newsweek via email that quick decisions are a key aspect of a pilot's viability because they are always on the brink of death. He has personally been involved in two similar situations. Once, the engine stopped working and its other engine didn't accelerate, but he held out long enough for the other engine to spin up and allow landing. Another time, he was fighting when his plane blew up, prompting him to eject immediately. You're one step away from being able to land, crash or eject, and you have to make that decision in a split second, Ellis said. That's really one of the important things about pilots. They can sort things out quickly and come to a right decision. Looks like you two made the right decision. I'm sure their friends and family will be celebrating tonight. Although Russia does not have a permanent MiG-31 Foxhound unit anywhere near the Ukrainian border. However, the Drive previously reported that temporary stations near the border have been set up since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. In addition to its main role as an interceptor, the MiG-31 also uses the strike capabilities of the Kinzhal hypersonic ballistic missile for long-range attacks, such as in March and April last year, according to details. Route of Moscow. Another report by the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI for short, claimed that the MiG-31 was responsible for shooting down Ukrainian fighters during high-altitude patrols, using air-to-air missiles. Its powerful Vimpel R-37M. On Wednesday, German and British warplanes intercepted 3 different models of Russian aircraft in international airspace over the Baltic Sea. 2 military planes Sukhoi 27 and an Ilyushin-20 crashed into the Baltic region, with all transponders turned off, the German armed forces wrote on Twitter, according to CNN. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Defense Ministry by email for comment. 6. Moscow says it noticed China's negotiating efforts after Xi and Zelensky's call. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Wednesday that Moscow had paid attention to China's willingness to create favorable conditions for negotiations with Ukraine following a phone call between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Chinese President Xi Jinping and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. We note the willingness of the Chinese side to try to establish the negotiating process, Zakharova said at a news conference on Wednesday. However, she also noted that under current conditions negotiations are unlikely and blamed Kyiv for rejecting Moscow's initiatives. It is still not clear which Moscow initiatives Ms. Zakharova refers to. On Tuesday, November 15, 2022, during a talk with leaders attending the G20 in Bali, Indonesia, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky outlined 10 preconditions for negotiations with Russia, among which Russia must withdraw its troops from the territories illegally occupied by Ukraine. In response, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, now vice chairman of the National Security Council, arrogantly declared that 10 conditions were too many. The Russian side only offered one condition to the Ukrainians: surrender immediately, instantly. Medvedev's statement cannot be seen as Moscow's peace initiative. Ukraine has repeatedly said that peace in the conflict will only be achieved if Russia restores its borders and Kyiv takes back Crimea. Earlier on Wednesday, Xi Jinping and Zelensky had their first phone call since Russia invaded Ukraine. Zelensky said he had a long and meaningful phone call. 7. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China sends an envoy to visit Ukraine. At a press conference on Wednesday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said their special envoy to Ukraine and other countries would be Li Hui, China's special envoy for Eurasian affairs. Li Hui is a former Chinese ambassador to Russia, who held the post from 2009 to 2019. In a phone call with Zelensky, Mr. Xi said Li would travel to Ukraine and other countries to help conduct in-depth communication with all parties for a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Wang Wenbin did not provide further details on when Mr. Li will make the trip and which other countries he will visit. Wednesday's call was the first time she spoke to Zelensky since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last February. 8. Putin signs decree on retaliatory measures for sanctions. Russian state news agency TASS reported that Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday signed a decree setting out retaliatory measures if Russian assets abroad are confiscated. The decree, also published on the website of the Kremlin, states that if Russian assets are confiscated by hostile countries, Moscow will place foreign assets in Russia under temporary control. His time. The decree also states that temporary asset management can only be reversed and refunded if the Russian president so decides. TASS reports that Moscow has temporarily managed the assets of the gas distribution unit Uniper SE in Russia. 9. Russia must stop using nuclear power to blackmail the world, Zelensky said during Chernobyl's celebration. The Chernobyl disaster has left a big scar, and Russia must be prevented from using nuclear energy to threaten the world, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Wednesday on the 37th anniversary of the worst nuclear disaster. Worst in history. We must do everything to prevent the terrorist state from using nuclear power facilities to blackmail Ukraine and the world, Zelensky wrote on Twitter. Ukraine's defense minister Alexei Reznikov said that the silence and lies of the Soviet totalitarian regime about the tragedy led to terrible consequences far beyond the borders of modern Ukraine. Today, Russia's barbaric attacks near Ukraine's nuclear facilities, its invasion of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and its transformation into a military base put the world at risk of a catastrophe. New, the scale of which could exceed the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, he added. Russian forces continue to control the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. The plant is regularly disconnected from Ukraine's power grid due to intense Russian shelling in the area, sparking fears across Europe of a nuclear accident. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, said on Wednesday he spoke with Zelensky to mark the anniversary, adding that the organization continued its efforts. Protection force of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Zelensky reiterated his belief that returning the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to the country he controls is the best way to prevent a nuclear disaster like the one that occurred at Chernobyl. On the anniversary of the Chernobyl tragedy, I had a phone call with IAEA Director Rafael Grossi, Zelensky said in a telegram on Wednesday. I stress that only the return of full Ukrainian control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will protect the world from a new catastrophe. I also thank the IAEA Special Program on Medical Assistance to Ukrainian Nuclear Workers, added Zelensky. What happened in Chernobyl? When an explosion tore through Chernobyl's No. 4 reactor on April 26, 1986, more than 30 people were killed near Pripyat, Ukraine. Countless others have died from radiation symptoms since then, according to the IAEA and the World Health Organization. The disaster created a cloud of fallout over hundreds of thousands of square miles of Ukraine, Russia and Belarus. The radioactive effect of the explosion was about 400 times stronger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. 10. Ukraine and Russia exchange more than 80 prisoners. We got 44 people home. There are 36 privates and sergeants, and 6 officers, the head of the Ukrainian President's office Andriy Yermak said in a telegram post on Wednesday. These are soldiers, border guards, National Guards and sailors. Yermak added that there were also 2 civilians among those released. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov said that 40 prisoners of war released by Ukraine were in danger of death. Released Russian POWs will be sent to Moscow for treatment and rehabilitation. 11. Ukrainian journalist killed in Russian attack, injured Italian colleague. A Ukrainian journalist working for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica was killed Wednesday in a Russian attack in Kherson that injured his Italian colleague, according to Ukrainian officials. As soon as I heard about this unfortunate event, I contacted our military force, who provided me with details about the incident. I have contacted journalist Corrado Zunino and I will do everything I can to help him, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said in an interview with Italian broadcaster Sky TG24. Kuleba said the Ukrainian journalist was killed in the incident, adding that Russian fighters don't care if it's Russian, Italian or Ukrainian, they always open fire. The first vice president of Kherson Regional Council, Yuri Sobolevsky, also confirmed to CNN that the Ukrainian journalist was killed and his body was taken to the local morgue for an autopsy. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani previously described the incident as a drone strike, but Sobolevsky told CNN that authorities in Kherson are still trying to determine the exact circumstances of the incident. Attack. CNN has reached out to journalist Corrado Zunino and Ukrainian authorities for more information. The Kremlin Palace did not immediately comment on the incident. 12. Russia expelled 10 Norwegian diplomats from its embassy in Moscow. 10 diplomats working at the Norwegian embassy in Moscow have been asked to leave Russia, a Norwegian Foreign Ministry spokesman said on Wednesday. Today, the Norwegian ambassador to Moscow was informed by the Russian Foreign Ministry that 10 of our diplomats at the embassy in Moscow have been declared unwelcome figures in Russia. Diplomats have to leave Russia shortly, said Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt. According to her, Oslo sees this move by Moscow as a response to Norway's expulsion of 15 Russian embassy employees earlier this month on charges of espionage. Norway's ambassador was summoned by Russia on Wednesday to express its strong opposition to Oslo's decision to expel 15 Russian diplomats, the Russian Foreign Ministry said in a statement. This hostile step further aggravates the situation in bilateral relations, which are already at an extremely low level, said Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. Anniken Huitfeldt described Russia's decision as an act of revenge, adding that all of our diplomats in Russia carry out normal diplomatic work. The Russian authorities are well aware of this.